You think you know cruelty. You think blood is unbreakable. A 2 a.m. call is never good. But this one was worse than death. It was reality. My son and my granddaughter, only 6 years old, were found under a bridge. This isn't a story about reclaiming a house. It's about reclaiming a soul by taking absolutely everything from the monster who stole it. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I am a librarian, nearly 60 years old, and I live a quiet life in Portland, Oregon. Or at least, I did. The phone shattered the silence at 2 in the morning. A call at that hour is never an announcement of joy. It is a herald of ruin. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, and devoid of all warmth. A social worker. She said the words that bifurcated my life into before and after. Mrs. Hayes, your son, Mark, and your granddaughter, Lily, have been found. Found. The word hung in the sterile air of my apartment. It is a word used for lost keys or missing pets, not for people you believed were safe. They were located, the voice continued, in an encampment under the St. John's Bridge. The images my mind conjured were disjointed, horrific. The St. John's, with its Gothic arches, a landmark. Now, a pit. The social worker clarified they were found inside their car, a 2005 Honda Civic, which was out of gas. Lily, my granddaughter, only 6 years old, was running a fever and was severely malnourished. Mark was being admitted with acute pneumonia. I stood there, the receiver cold against my ear, unable to process the information. I was paralyzed. The last time I had managed to get Mark on the phone, perhaps a month ago, he had been distant, but he said things were fine. That was his word. Fine. His wife, Simone, was on a fantastic business trip to Australia. She was networking, expanding her brand. I do not remember hanging up. I was suddenly in my own car, the windshield wipers battling the relentless Oregon rain. The drive to the hospital was a blur of slick asphalt and the screech of tires that were not my own. My mind was a vortex, pulling me back 5 years. I saw Mark's wedding. I saw Simone, radiant and perfect in white, gliding down the aisle. And I saw the look she gave me during the reception, a fleeting glance as I raised my glass for a toast. It was not dislike. It was dismissal, as if I were a piece of lint on her couture, a stain to be ignored. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and despair. A nurse guided me to a room. I saw him first. Mark, my son, who I had held, who I had taught to read. He was a skeleton draped in a hospital gown. His beard was matted, his cheeks hollowed out, and he looked a decade older than his 34 years. He tried to sit up when he saw me, but the effort dissolved into a racking, wet cough that shook his entire frame. He would not, could not, look me in the eye. He just turned his face to the pillow and wept. Then I saw her. Lily. She was curled on her side in the cot next to his bed, blissfully asleep, an IV tube taped to one arm and a plastic hospital band on her tiny wrist. Even in her exhaustion, she was beautiful. As I watched, her lips moved, and she whispered a single, heart-breaking question into the sterilized air. "Did Mommy bring me a koala?" The social worker found me in the hallway as I tried to breathe. She delivered the facts with blunt, practiced efficiency. They had been living in that Civic for 3 weeks. Their house, the one I had helped them with the down payment for, had been foreclosed on 2 months ago. 2 months. The panic that had been choking me began to recede, and something else took its place. It was not hot fury. It was a cold, dense, heavy thing. It settled in my stomach like ice. I walked back into the room, past the sleeping form of my granddaughter, and stood at the foot of my son's bed. He was still crying silently. I asked him only one question, my voice low and steady. "Does Simone know about this?" Mark flinched. He shook his head, a pathetic, jerky movement. His voice was a raw whisper. She said she was busy, raising capital. That cold, heavy weight in my stomach was knowledge, the kind of knowledge that does not announce itself, but simply waits to be acknowledged. Standing in that hospital corridor, breathing in the smell of bleach and sickness, I was pulled back 3 years, to a much happier time. Or so I had thought. I had just taken early retirement from Novatech Solutions, 25 years in management, ending with a comfortable 401k and plans for a quiet life of books and gardening. A life that involved being a full-time grandmother. Simone, however, had other plans. She arrived at my bungalow not with Lily, but with a leather-bound presentation. She had a communications degree and a blinding amount of confidence. She spread the papers on my coffee table, a glossy projection of her future. A lifestyle brand. Her plan was a soup of fashionable words. It was about synergy, curated content, and personal branding. It was, to my eyes, completely vacant. It was a plan to be famous for being famous. Then came the price tag. She needed, she said, $150,000 for initial seed capital. I must have looked as stunned as I felt. It was an astronomical sum. "Simone," I said gently, "this is a lot of money. The plan seems thin." Her smile tightened. Her eyes, which were always so bright and engaging for her audience, turned flat and cold. "You just do not understand the new market, Eleanor. This is how brands are built now." She left, and an hour later, Mark arrived. He had been sent. He could never deny her anything. He sat on the edge of my sofa, wringing his hands, looking just as he had when he was 12 and begging for a new bike I could not afford. "Mum, please," he said, his voice low. "She worked so hard on this. This is our chance. For us. For Lily." He was always weak. My Mark. Eager to please, desperate for the approval of this woman who treated him like an accessory. But he was my son, and Lily was my granddaughter. I looked at the photos on my mantelpiece. Lily covered in mud in my garden. Mark holding her on his shoulders. I wanted them to have a good life. I wanted, foolishly, for Simone to be happy, thinking it would make my son happy. So I did it. I went to my financial advisor, who begged me not to. I ignored him. I cashed out nearly my entire retirement fund. The anemic, flimsy plan of a 30-year-old influencer meant more to me than my own future security. The signing was at a sterile, downtown law office. Simone's lawyer, a man with a shark's smile, slid the documents across the table. The money was not going to Simone. It was going to Simone Lifestyle, LLC. I remember one detail clearly. I was just about to sign when Simone stopped me. "Oh, Eleanor," she said, as if she had just remembered. "My lawyer says it will make the initial loan process easier if we structure this a certain way. He wants you to sign as a silent partner on the LLC formation." I paused. "What does that mean?" "It is just a formality," she insisted, all bright teeth and reassurance. "It just shows the bank a stable asset base. It does not mean anything. Really." I signed where she pointed. The first year was a whirlwind of her success. The $150,000 vanished. It became a lease on a sleek office in the Pearl District, top-of-the-line camera and lighting equipment, and a new wardrobe of designer clothes, all necessary for her content. I would see her posts online. Her laughing with a cocktail. Her modelling a new coat. I also saw my son, Mark, who had a good job as a graphic designer, was suddenly working overtime. He looked tired. The business is taking off, he would tell me, forcing a smile when I brought cookies. Simone just needs a little help with the daily bills while she gets established. I remember the unease, a small, bitter seed in my throat. Simone was taking research trips, a weekend in Los Angeles to feel the vibe, a 4-day trip to New York to network with creatives. Mark stayed home, packing lunches for Lily, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Now, standing in the hospital, the ice in my stomach solidified into a spike. I saw it all with perfect, devastating clarity. The business plan, the silent partner maneuver, the slow, methodical draining of my son while she built her platform. That $150,000 was never an investment in their future. It was her ticket, her escape hatch, and I had not just paid for it, I had built it for her. After they were discharged, I brought them home. Not to their home, the one that was gone, but to my small apartment. It was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. I made Lily a bed on my sofa, and she was asleep in seconds, clutching a stuffed bear I had kept from her toddler days. Mark sat at my small kitchen table, staring into a mug of tea he was not drinking. He was a ghost. The pneumonia had ravaged him, but it was the shame that had hollowed him out. He sat there for a long time, and then, in a voice so low I had to lean in, he began to talk. The story spilled out of him, a poisoned, dammed-up river. It was a story of 1,000 tiny cuts. Simone, he explained, had taken over their finances completely after I gave them the money. She said I was bad with numbers, he whispered, looking at his trembling hands. She said I didn't understand investment, and she needed to control the flow for the business. Then came the isolation. It started slowly. My calls would go to voicemail. My texts would get a short, terse reply hours later. Simone's busy. Mum. When I offered to have them over for Sunday dinner, there was always an excuse. Simone has a content deadline. Mom. Finally, after I pressed him, the truth came out. You just do not understand. He had snapped at me over the phone 6 months ago. You stress Simone out, she says. She says you are controlling, that you are toxic, and you are just jealous of her success. Toxic. Me. The woman who had given them my retirement. The woman who had only ever asked to see her granddaughter. I had stopped calling after that, believing I was giving them space. I was, in reality, obeying Simone's command, delivered through my own son. Now, at my kitchen table, he admitted the rest. The business was not making money. It was hemorrhaging it. To fund her brand, Simone had secretly opened multiple credit cards, all in Mark's name. I did not know until the calls started, he said, tears rolling down his gaunt cheeks. Dozens of calls a day. We were buried. He had tried to get control, but she had an answer for everything. She created crises, emergencies that required his constant attention, pulling him away from his own job. She would call me at work, screaming, he said. saying Lily was sick, or the landlord was there, or the internet was down and she was losing a contract. I was always leaving. My boss warned me. Then he warned me again. Last month. They let me go. He lost his job. He lost his job as a graphic designer, the career he loved, because she could not stand for him to have anything that was not her. Then came the final, brutal twist, the part that made the ice in my chest crack and reform into something sharp as glass. She was the one who told us to stay in the car. He choked out. I stopped breathing. What? When the eviction notice came, I panicked. I said we would have to go to a shelter. She forbade it. He was shaking so hard, the teacup rattled in its saucer. She said if word got out, it would destroy her brand. She said it was just for a couple of weeks. Just until she flew to Australia and closed the big deal. She said it would be an adventure for me and Lily. She said to camp out. I looked at this broken man, my son, who had been convinced that living in a Honda Civic with a sick 6-year-old was a better option than destroying the brand of the woman who was abandoning them. I listened. I did not yell. I did not cry. My anger was so pure and so cold, it had become a kind of clarity. I was not even angry at Mark. I pitied him. I saw now that his weakness was not a simple flaw. It was a vulnerability that this predator had exploited. Simone had not just left them. She had not just taken the money and run. She had systematically, deliberately, and with horrifying precision, disabled him. She had cut him off from his family, destroyed his career, ruined his credit, and shattered his self-worth. She had hollowed him out until he was nothing but a vessel for her needs. And when he was empty, she had ordered him and his child into a car to rot. Also her image would remain untarnished. This was not abandonment. This was an execution. And she had simply left the bodies behind, assuming no one would ever come looking for them. I waited until the sound of Lily's soft, even breathing filled the small apartment. Mark was sedated on painkillers and sleeping a dead, dreamless sleep on my recliner. The apartment was still, finally safe. I sat at my desk and turned on my old laptop. I am a librarian. I know how to find information. But before Novatech, before the library, I worked in contract management. I know how to read the fine print. I started somewhere simple. I started where she lived. Instagram. Her account, of course, was public. A brand needs an audience. It was not just active. It was brilliant. A curated feed of success and sun-drenched perfection. My son and my granddaughter were sleeping off malnutrition and pneumonia, and their wife and mother was a star. There she was, on the deck of a gleaming white yacht, the sails of the Sydney Opera House behind her, a champagne flute in her hand. Her hair was blonder, her teeth whiter. There she was, dining at a restaurant with a panoramic view of the city lights, laughing, her head tilted back. There she was, in a white bathrobe, holding a coffee mug on the balcony of what was clearly a luxury penthouse apartment. The hashtags were a flurry of triumphant nonsense. Hashtag boss babe. Hashtag living my best life. Hashtag Sydney dreams. Hashtag entrepreneur. Hashtag blessed. I scrolled. I scrolled back 1 week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months, 3. The images of her lavish new life were endless. I kept scrolling. A cold, methodical sickness growing in me. I scrolled back 6 months. 7. Not one picture of Mark. Not one single mention of my granddaughter. It was as if they had ceased to exist the moment she decided they were inconvenient. Then I saw him. He appeared subtly at first, a hand on her arm in a group photo. Then, a cheers with his glass. Then, she tagged him, an Australian name. I clicked. His profile was also public. He was a real estate developer, at least 30 years older than her, with a leathery tan and a portfolio of properties across the city. He was in almost all of her pictures for the last 3 months. This was not a business trip. Mark had said she left 3 weeks ago for the big meeting, but her feed told a different story. She had been in Australia for 3 months. She had been posing on yachts and drinking champagne while her child was starving in a car. The anger was so cold, it was almost paralyzing. I took a steadying breath. Do not feel fined. I used the skills from my old life at Novatech. I dug up an old email from her, one she had sent me years ago from her personal account. I ran a trace on the IP address. It was a simple trick, but it worked. The address was not a hotel. It was not a corporate office. It was a high-end residential building. I cross-referenced the name of the developer. It was one of his properties. She was not visiting. She was living there. I needed the last piece. I went to Mark's wallet, which I had taken from his soiled jeans, with his permission, which he had given me in a blanket. Desperate, do whatever you need to plea at the hospital. I took out his bank card. I called the bank. I navigated the automated menus, used his information, and finally got a human being. I reported a potential fraud concern, which was not a lie. I asked for the last several months of statements. The joint account, the one they shared, had been emptied of its last dollar on the same day she flew to Sydney 3 months ago. A one-way ticket. I now realized. I closed the laptop. The screen went black, but the image of her was burned into my mind. Simone, laughing by an infinity pool. The Sydney skyline stretched out behind her like a prize she had won. From the next room, I heard Lily cough in her sleep, a small, dry sound. The plan began to form. It was not a plan for justice. It was a plan for removal, a precise, surgical excision. I am not just a librarian. That is my quiet life, the one I chose. Before that, for 20 years. I was a senior contract administrator at Novatech Solutions. My job was to read, understand, and enforce multi-million-dollar agreements. I am fluent in the language of liability, termination clauses, and fiduciary duty. And Simone, in her infinite arrogance, had forgotten that. I left Mark and Lily sleeping and went to my garage. It was cold, smelling of damp earth and old paint. In the back, under a dusty tarp, was a stack of file boxes. I found the one I was looking for, labelled Retirement 2022. I carried the heavy box into my small, bright kitchen, set it on the table, and opened it. There they were. Beneath my own retirement papers was the sleek, dark blue folder her lawyer had given me. Simone Lifestyle, LLC, Formation Documents. I made a fresh cup of coffee. I sat down and I began to read. I did not just skim. I read every line. I read the articles of incorporation. I read the initial filing with the state. And then I read the full operating agreement, the one I had been too trusting, too hopeful, too foolish to properly scrutinize 3 years ago. Simone's lawyer had been clever, but he was not protecting me. He was protecting the viability of the loan applications. Simone, with her non-existent credit and my son's already strained finances, was not enough to secure the kind of capital she wanted. I was. My assets were the collateral. I saw the silent partner addendum I had signed. It was, as she'd said, a formality, a document stipulating I would have no say in the creative direction of the brand. But that was not the important page. The important page was Exhibit A Members and Ownership. My breath caught. There, in stark black and white, was the structure. To satisfy the lenders, to make the entire entity legitimate. The lawyer had structured it based on the capital contribution. Managing member Eleanor Hayes. Ownership interest, 51%. Member Simone Hayes. Ownership interest, 49%. I read it again, and again. She had called me a silent partner, and I had been one. But on paper, the paper that mattered, the paper filed with the state and the banks, I was the managing member. I was the majority owner. She had been so blinded by her own ego, so focused on getting the money. She had ignored the legal reality, or perhaps, in her laziness, she had simply forgotten. She had never filed to amend the agreement. She had never bought me out. She had just taken the money and assumed her title as founder was the same as owner. It was not, legally. Eleanor Hayes owned Simone Lifestyle, LLC. I pulled out the bank statements I had printed. I looked at the Instagram feed still open on my laptop, the penthouse in Darling Point, rented through the LLC, the designer clothes, charged to the LLC's credit card, the first-class plane ticket to Sydney, a company expense. She was not just living a glamorous life. She was committing flagrant corporate fraud. She was using company assets for personal gain, a direct and catastrophic violation of her fiduciary duty to the majority shareholder. To me, a feeling spread through my chest, pushing out the cold and the fear. It was a hot, sharp, and intensely focused rage. I looked at the signature page, her sloppy, arrogant signature next to my own careful, looping one. I smiled, a thin, cold smile that did not reach my eyes. This was not a messy divorce. This was not a custody battle. This was a corporate dissolution. And I was not a heartbroken mother-in-law. I was the boss. And she was an employee who had been stealing from the firm. The next morning, I did not call a divorce attorney. I did not call Child Protective Services. I called Brenda Ramirez. Brenda was not a lawyer in the way people think of them. She was a weapon. I had seen her work twice during my time at Novatech, dismantling competitors who had tried to poach our intellectual property. She was a corporate litigator, a shark, as the young executives called her, and she was terrifyingly precise. I got an appointment for that afternoon, citing an emergency stakeholder matter from my Novatech days. Her office was on the 30th floor, all glass and steel, overlooking the very bridge where my son had been found. I sat across from her, a woman my age, impeccably dressed, her eyes sharp and appraising. "Eleanor," she said, her voice neutral. "It has been a long time. What is this emergency?" I did not speak. I simply slid the blue LLC folder across the polished mahogany desk. I added the printouts of the bank statements showing the withdrawals and the lease payments. On top of that, I placed a stack of glossy, high-resolution prints from Simone's Instagram feed. The yacht, the penthouse, the champagne. Brenda looked at the photos first, a flicker of distaste in her eyes. "A vain employee. My daughter-in-law," I said, "and the 49% member of that LLC?" Brenda's eyebrows shot up. She opened the folder. She read. Her skepticism vanished, replaced by a focused, intense stillness. She read the operating agreement, her finger tracing the ownership clause. She read it twice. She finally looked up at me, and for the first time, her professional mask slipped, revealing a glint of predatory interest. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, her voice dropping. "You are not a silent partner. You are the managing member. You own 51% of this company. Every asset purchased by this LLC, every dollar in its accounts, it all belongs to you." "I know," I said. "That is why I am here." I told her everything. The 2 a.m. phone call, the hospital, the pneumonia, the malnutrition, the car under the St. John's Bridge. I told her about the lies, the isolation, and the business trip to Australia. Brenda listened without interruption. Her expression did not change, but her eyes grew colder. When I finished, she folded her hands on her desk. "This is not a family matter. Eleanor," she said, her voice crisp. "This is unequivocal corporate malfeasance. She is using company assets for personal enrichment while defrauding the majority stakeholder. That is you. The fact that the victims are your son and granddaughter is leverage, not the primary complaint." She stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city. "Here is what we do," she said, turning back to me. "Step 1 is simple. We establish the breach. Her public Instagram feed is a signed confession of her misuse of company funds. That is done." She tapped the stack of photos. "Step 2. As the 51% managing member, you have the unilateral right to call an emergency vote to remove a minority member for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. We will hold that vote. You are the only one voting. She is removed. Effective immediately. Step 3, she continued, is the kill shot. The moment she is removed, she loses all signing authority. We file an emergency ex parte motion with the court. We will show the judge the fraud, the endangerment of your family, and the high flight risk. We will ask for an immediate, temporary restraining order that freezes every asset of Simone Lifestyle, LLC, every bank account, domestic and international, every credit card. She paused, then picked up the printout of Simone on the penthouse balcony. Step 4 is the consequence. You said she is in Sydney. This apartment is paid for by the LLC. The visa she is on is almost certainly a business visa sponsored by the LLC. When I freeze those accounts, her rent check will bounce. More importantly, when I notify the Australian government that the sponsoring company is under investigation for fraud and has terminated her employment, her visa will be cancelled. Brenda sat down, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. She will be an unemployed, undocumented person in a foreign country with no access to money, all in one motion. A wave of vertigo hit me, the sheer speed and brutality of it. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Brenda Ramirez smiled. It was the first time I had seen it, and it was not comforting. "I need to make a few calls to get us in front of the right judge," she said, picking up her phone. "But with an emergency order like this, given the risk to a minor, I can have her accounts frozen in 48 hours. Brenda was true to her word. 48 hours later, the motion was granted. The accounts were frozen. The termination was filed. It was 3 days after my visit to the lawyer's office. 3 days of watching Lily's pale cheeks get a little colour back. 3 days of watching Mark sleep, and then wake, and then eat, and then talk to a therapist I had arranged for him. My apartment, once a quiet sanctuary of solitude, was now a recovery ward. It was safe. I was in the kitchen, slicing a banana for Lily's cereal. The morning light was streaming in, and I could hear her humming to a cartoon in the living room. It was a moment of absolute, fragile peace. Then my phone rang, vibrating hard against the kitchen counter. I looked at the screen. The number was long, prefixed with the country code for Australia. I picked it up. I pressed speaker. I continued slicing the banana. Eleanor! The voice was not the light, breezy, aspirational tone from her videos. This was a shriek, a raw, ragged sound, stripped of all its polish. Eleanor, what the hell did you do? Good morning, Simone, I said, my voice even. Do not good morning me. My cards, they are not working. None of them. The bank says the account is locked. What did you do? Simone Lifestyle, LLC, I stated, as if reading from a memo, is currently under a full internal audit due to suspicion of gross financial fraud. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end. Then, a sharp, incredulous laugh. What are you talking about? We are not fraudulent. That is my company, you crazy old woman. That is where you are mistaken, I said, placing the banana slices carefully into the bowl. According to the Articles of Incorporation, it is, in fact, my company, at 51% ownership, and as the majority managing member. I held an emergency vote 2 days ago, citing your direct breach of fiduciary duty and misappropriation of company funds. I voted to remove you from any and all operational roles, effective immediately. The sound that came through the phone was animalistic, a half scream, half gasp. You cannot do that. I will sue you. I will sue you for everything. I will take everything you have. Go ahead, I said, picking up the milk. You will need to find a lawyer who works for free. In the meantime, all corporate bank accounts are frozen, pending the outcome of the audit. I believe your penthouse lease is paid directly from that account, and your corporate credit card, I imagine those will be problematic. Good luck. I was about to hang up. I was done. But then, her voice changed again. The rage was replaced by a new, higher, thinner sound. A sound of pure, unadulterated panic. Wait, oh God. Oh God, no. You cannot. She stammered. My visa. Eleanor. My visa. It is tied to the company. It is a business sponsorship. You cannot do this. I paused, holding the phone, and looked at the cereal bowl. I thought of Lily, whispering about a koala in a hospital bed. I thought of Mark's wet, racking cough under the damp concrete of the St. John's Bridge. Oh, I said. What a shame. I let the silence stretch, letting her hang by that single thread. I suppose, I continued, my voice as cold and clear as the morning air, that my attorney, as a legal formality, will have to notify the Australian Department of Home Affairs that your sponsoring company is no longer operational, and that you, its former employee, have been terminated while under investigation for felony fraud. No, no, you vicious, evil old hag. You are ruining my life. You are ruining my... I pressed end call. The silence of the apartment rushed back in, broken only by the cheerful, tinny music from the television. Grandma, Lily called from the other room. Is breakfast ready? Almost, sweetheart. I called back. Almost. The aftermath was not a victory parade. It was a clean-up, a slow, methodical sweeping up of the shrapnel left behind by an explosion. While the legal machinery ground away in Australia, I took control of what was left of Simone Lifestyle, LLC in Portland. With Brenda's guidance, I exercised my authority as managing member to liquidate every remaining asset. We terminated the lease on the absurdly expensive office in the Pearl District. We sold the high-end cameras, the lighting rigs, the iMacs, and the racks of designer clothes she had passed off as content wardrobe. It was a fire sale. When the accounting was done, after Brenda's substantial fees were paid, there was just enough to repay the $150,000 I had taken from my 401k, and just enough to pay off the crippling credit card debt over $50,000 that she had racked up in Mark's name. His credit was ruined, but at least the bleeding was stopped. Mark began seeing a therapist, a kind but firm woman who specialized in trauma. He was not just recovering from pneumonia, he was recovering from years of systematic psychological abuse. He had to face the hard truth that the woman he loved had viewed him as a resource to be depleted and then discarded. Some days were good. Some days, I would find him just sitting in the living room, staring at nothing, and I knew he was rebuilding himself, brick by painful brick. A week later, I got a call from Brenda. Her voice was tight with a new kind of anger. "Eleanor, our Australian counterparts found something," she explained. In her panic, Simone had apparently tried to leverage her personal situation with her Australian lover, demanding he intervene. He did not. Instead, he had his own lawyers contact Brenda's team to ensure he was shielded from any liability. In doing so, his lawyers revealed a crucial detail. Simone was pregnant, and it was his. The timing was precise. She had planned it all. She was never coming back. The goal was to secure the new life, the new man, and the new family, all financed by my retirement. Mark and Lily were not just baggage. They were the old life she was setting on fire before she stepped onto the plane. The news from Australia came quickly after that. The developer, terrified of being linked to a fraud investigation, cut her off completely, without funds, without her lover's protection, and with an expired visa. She was flagged by immigration authorities. She was arrested. A few weeks later, she was deported, flown back to the United States in the custody of federal marshals. She landed in Portland with nothing but the clothes she was wearing. She was immediately arrested on state charges. As the representative of the LLC, I had filed the criminal complaint for felony fraud and embezzlement. Mark, who was finally starting to look like himself again, did the last thing he needed to do. He filed for divorce. He petitioned for sole, undisputed custody of Lily. Simone did not contest it. She had no lawyer, no money, and no standing. She was in the county jail, awaiting her hearing. I went to see her. Once. I did not go for her, or even for me. I went to close the door. The visitation room was painted a sickly green and smelled of stale coffee and fear. She was brought out in an orange jumpsuit. Her blonde hair was dark at the roots, her face puffy and pale. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a dull, exhausted resentment. We sat on opposite sides of the thick glass, speaking through a crackling receiver. She looked at me, her eyes flat. "You ruined my life." I said nothing. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why would you do this? You had money. You could have just given me more. You could have just let me go." I looked at her, at this hollow thing that had caused so much pain. I thought of the penthouse, the champagne, the hashtags. I thought of the cold, damp concrete of the bridge. "My son was under a bridge. Simone," I said, my voice quiet, final. My 6-year-old granddaughter had a fever and was starving. You were by a pool. That is all. I stood up, placed the receiver back on its hook, and walked out without looking back. Simone was in a cell, awaiting trial. Mark was in therapy, slowly finding his footing. Lily was in my living room, finally safe, laughing at cartoons. But the fight was not over. The shrapnel was still embedded in our lives. The house, the small suburban 2-bedroom where Lily had taken her first steps, was gone. It had been seized by the bank, emptied, and was scheduled for a public auction in 3 weeks. I looked at the listing online, a sterile, bleak photograph of a home I had once loved visiting. My first instinct was to let it go. It was a haunted place, full of bad memories. But it was also the only asset, the only piece of her childhood that Lily had left. Simone had taken the money. She had destroyed Mark's career. She would not have this house. I went back to the file boxes. I am a librarian, but I am also a contract administrator. I pulled the thick stack of papers related to their original mortgage, the one I had co-signed on to help them get a lower rate. Everything was in order. But the foreclosure notice was not for that mortgage. It was for a different, much larger loan. I went to the county records office. I spent an afternoon pulling documents. The picture became clear. 1 year ago, after Simone had secured my retirement money, she had gone for more. She had convinced Mark to refinance the house, to pull out nearly $100,000 in equity. Equity they did not really have. I knew Mark's credit was terrible by that point. He could not have secured that loan alone. I kept digging through the digital files until I found it. The guarantor addendum. And my name. My signature was at the bottom of a document, pledging my own assets as collateral for their refinancing. A document I had never seen in my life. I zoomed in. It was a brilliant forgery. It was almost perfect. But I have signed my name, Eleanor Hayes, the same way for 40 years. The loop on my E is wide. The tail on my Y kicks sharply to the left. This signature was cramped. It was hers. She had convinced Mark to sign, and then she had forged my name to guarantee the loan she had presumably emptied and then defaulted on, triggering the foreclosure. The entire loan was built on a federal crime. I did not feel rage. I felt a cold, sharp precision. I called Brenda. "We do not sue," Brenda said, her voice sharp and excited after I explained. "Suing is for victims. We are in a position of power. A bank, a federally insured financial institution, approved a 6-figure loan based on a blatant forgery. They did not do their due diligence. This is not a lawsuit. Eleanor, this is a negotiation." Brenda arranged the meeting. She would not let me attend. She went in alone, armed with a file. On one side, my original, notarized mortgage signature. On the other, the forged document. She told me later that the 2 bank vice presidents were arrogant, prepared to discuss a settlement. Then she laid out the documents. She pointed out the forgery. She pointed out that the notary public who had witnessed my signature was a woman who had been a bridesmaid at Simone's wedding. Brenda's terms were not a request. They were a demand. 1. The bank would immediately void the fraudulent refinance in its entirety. They would absorb the $100,000 loss as the cost of their negligence. 2. They would immediately cancel the foreclosure auction. 3. They would reinstate the original, modest mortgage in my name only. In exchange, I would not file a criminal complaint against the bank for fraud, nor would I take this story to the press. The bank, facing a public relations nightmare and undeniable legal exposure, agreed to every term before Brenda had even finished her coffee. 3 days later, I held the keys to the house. Mark was not ready to go inside, so I went by myself, armed with cleaning supplies. The place had been picked clean. Simone had taken everything of value, leaving only trash and broken furniture. I was in the master bedroom, cleaning out the closet, when I noticed the carpet was loose near the back wall. I pulled it back. Underneath, set into the floorboards, was a small, flat, digital safe. I called Mark. He had no idea it existed. I paid a locksmith to come and drill it open. Inside, there was no paperwork. There was a plastic-wrapped bundle of cash, mostly $100 bills, totaling $20,000. There were 3 small, heavy bars of gold bullion, and underneath it all, there was a passport. A valid Canadian passport, in a name I did not recognize, with Simone's picture in it. This was never just about a new life with a rich man in Sydney. That was just one option. This was her real plan. She was going to drain us dry, and then she was going to disappear completely. She was going to become a different person, leaving Mark and Lily to drown in the debt of her crimes. I carefully placed the passport, the cash, and the gold into a duffel bag. I drove to the district attorney's office and handed the new evidence to the prosecutor handling Simone's case. This was no longer just fraud. This was a premeditated plan of abandonment. It did not end in a courtroom. Not really. The final act of this story took place over the following year, a slow and quiet reconstruction. The evidence I found in the safe, the forged passport, the cash, the gold, was the final nail. Faced with an overwhelming case, Simone's arrogance finally shattered. To avoid a trial that would have exposed every detail of her cruelty, she pleaded guilty to felony fraud, identity theft, and 2 counts of child endangerment. She is currently serving a 3-year sentence in a state correctional facility. Her name is on a permanent list, her visa was revoked, and she is barred from ever entering Australia again. She is a prisoner, not just of the state, but of the empty, failed life she built. Mark's healing was a different kind of sentence. He attended therapy 3 times a week. He had to learn how to exist outside the shadow of her manipulation. He had to forgive himself for his weakness, for choosing to believe her lies over the evidence of his own eyes. Slowly, the man I knew returned. He found a new job, a stable position as a graphic designer at a local firm. He started laughing again. He started being a father again. I sold the foreclosed house. As soon as the bank signed the title over to me, I put it on the market. I thought I had fought for it for Lily. But when I stood in those empty rooms, all I could feel were the ghosts of what had happened. It was not a home. It was a scar. You cannot build a new life on top of a grave. I took the money from the sale and added what remained of my restored 400K. I did not buy a large house. I bought a small, sturdy duplex in a quiet neighborhood, one with old trees and a good elementary school. It is perfect. I live in Unit A. Mark and Lily live in Unit B. We have our own doors, our own lives. But we share a small backyard, and I am only ever a few steps away. I am not his crutch. I am his safety net. He is learning to be a man again, and I am getting to be a grandmother. The real climax of this story was not the phone call to Australia. It was not the day she was sentenced. It was last Tuesday, the day they moved in. I was standing on my new porch as Mark carried the last of his boxes into his side. He looked tired, but it was the healthy fatigue of hard work, not the hollow exhaustion of despair. He stopped, wiping his hands on his jeans. I walked over and held out my hand. On my palm, there was a single, shiny key. "This is yours," I said. He did not take it right away. He just looked at it, then up at my face. His eyes were clear, the haunted, hunted look finally gone. "Mum," he said, his voice thick, "I am so sorry. For everything. For the money. For not believing you. For all of it." I closed his fingers around the key. "You do not have to be sorry anymore, Mark," I said. "You just have to be better. For you. And for her." He nodded, a single, sharp movement, and went inside his new home. That night, we did not bother with furniture. We sat on the floor of my empty living room, surrounded by boxes, and ate pizza from the carton. And Lily, now 7 years old and thriving, told a long, rambling story about a dog she met at the park, and she let out a loud, beautiful, unrestrained laugh. It was the most wonderful sound in the world. My son, sitting next to me, laughed with her. The sound echoed in the empty room, filling the space. The revenge was complete. It was not her destruction. She had accomplished that all on her own. It was this. It was the sound of my family, reborn and safe, and the absolute, ironclad knowledge that she could never, ever touch us again. Thank you all so much for listening to my story. Please comment below and let me know where you are listening from. Share your thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, like this video, and support us by hitting that hype button so more people can hear this story.